Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's so great to see so many of you. As always, I wish we could be having these events in person, but I'm Raymond Robertson. I'm the director of the Mosbacher Institute. Recently, the Mosbacher Institute has launched a really important global value chains program. And this is one of our key events of the semester surrounding that, because we have two of the key leaders and thought leaders in the area of global value chains. I'm so excited to have both Dr. Lefteris Iakovou and Professor Gary Gereffi to join us here today. I'm going to introduce both of them, and then we're going to let them start off with some introductory remarks and then just basically have a discussion. And so we're looking forward to you sending in comments or questions into the chat, and I'll moderate those. And then we'll have a discussion, and we're really looking forward to your input. As I said, I'm so excited to have these two speakers today. They're really outstanding. I'm going to introduce Dr. Lefteris Iakovou first. He's the Director of Manufacturing and Logistics Innovation Initiatives at the Texas A&M Engineering Experimental Station, which we call TEAS, and the Harvey Hubbell Professor of Industrial Distribution Program at Texas A&M University. He's the Director of the Supply Chain Management for the Secure America Institute at TAMU, which is a national consortium of industry and academia focusing on resilient and secure manufacturing supply chains for the United States. And he's also the Associate Director for Supply Chain Management and the Applied Operations Research at the Texas A&M Center for Applied Technology, TCAT, of the TEAS. He has courtesy appointments as a professor of supply chain management at the Mosbacher Institute with us, and he also serves as supply chain lead for the Texas A&M Emergency Management Advisory Group that Texas A&M established at the onset of COVID-19 pandemic. He's published more than 235 papers in peer-reviewed journals and conference proceedings, as well as 2 books and 3 textbooks. We're going to be joined also by Professor Gary Gereffi, who's world famous for his work for global value chains, and he's an emeritus professor of sociology and the director of the Global Value Chain Center at Duke University. He has published over a dozen books and numerous articles on globalization, industrial upgrading, social and economic development, and is one of the originators of the global value chains framework. Actually, he published in the Journal of International Economics, which is a groundbreaking paper that we all read in graduate school. So it's really exciting to have him today. His most recent books are a handbook on global value chains in 2019 and the Global Value Chains and Development, Redefining the Contours of 21st Century Capitalism in 2018. His current projects include the impact of protectionism on jobs and regional trade agreements, and evaluating how the digital economy and Industry 4.0 are likely to affect international business strategies and industrial upgrading, and shifting regional interdependencies in East Asia and North America with a focus on China, South Korea, and Mexico vis-a-vis the United States. I couldn't imagine 2 better people to launch us off with this program, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Iakovou. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. I would like to thank, first of all, Dr. Raymond Robertson, who honors me with his friendship and his bravery, allow me to say, Raymond, of reaching out of the Bush School to engineering to establish this interdisciplinary initiative. I think one of the things that I will try to point out is the new realities demand this interdisciplinarity. And I'm humbled by the presence of Gary Gereffi. Gary is a leader that I've been following through closely. I want to thank first Andrew Ignatius, the professor and leader of the Scowcroft Institute, for recommending that Raymond and I start talking to each other about this a year ago. So I'm sure Andrew is not here, but I want to be on the record of thanking him, and I want to thank Jennifer Moore and Cynthia Cost for all her hard work of making this happen. So I'm going to start by just saying what happened last week. Last week, the Suez Canal was blocked by 200,000-ton metaphor, if you want, of globalization, which is the ever-given ship, right? And it's a metaphor, it's an emblem of the backlash that accuses globalization of going too far, right? Since indeed the early 1990s, supply chains were run to maximize efficiency. And the pinnacle of that was the inclusion, December 11 of 2001, which is a critical day, the inclusion of China to the World Trade Organization. Firms indeed try to specialize and concentrate particular tasks in China. I'll talk a little more about this. But now, along with COVID, everybody talks about supply chains. And everybody talks about issues of resilience. So I would like to define, allow me, Raymond, what a supply chain is. I would like to define what the resilience is, so we can have this discussion more structured, if you allow me to use these words. We have semiconductor shortages. I'm giving you a nutshell of what global supply chains are facing today, April 7th, 2021. We have shortages of semiconductor chips globally. Ford just announced it will shut down its manufacturing plants in Dearborn, Michigan, where they make pickup trucks for 2 weeks, due to unavailability of semiconductor chips. A small company called H&M that I know Raymond has been consulting, the leader of fast fashion, right, has been blacklisted and has disappeared for all e-commerce sites in China because of its sustainability report refuses to source cotton from the Xinjiang province of China due to issues related to forced labor and concentration camps of the Uyghurs. The European Union and India have closed down exports of jabs, of vaccines to the rest of the world. So what we see here is the pandemic exacerbated structural problems the supply chains have had. And allow me to say that for the first time, deservedly so, and this is a bipartisan issue both for President Trump and President Biden, economic security is tied more than ever to national security. And global supply chains are critical to both of these issues. What is a supply chain? The supply chain is an extended enterprise where we do a lot of different things. We plan, in other words, we design, we plan, we buy, we procure, we make, we move, and we sell. Plan, buy, make, move, sell, extended over the globe. And at the same token, within a supply chain, we manage not just the containers that the ever given container ship was carrying. We manage information flows, financial flows, and process flows. And the greater ones know how to do that synergistically. And I'm quoting Walmart's and the Dells of the 90s with an outstanding 10,000% return on investment. So what happened, allow me to go back and say the following. Beginning in the 90s and accelerating after the inclusion of China, as I said, December 2001 in the WTO, the United States elite, bipartisanship, made erroneous assumptions that I can quote some of them. Before Raymond, the call, I wrote down some of them, to pressure for the inclusion of China in the world order and in WTO, where, allow me to say that when we talk about globalization, I got to make a point in saying, I'm not talking about just sourcing all over the globe. I'm talking specifically about trading with, transferring technology to, and investing to China. So indeed, what we have had with US multinationals, I remind everybody that the former CEO of FedEx was instrumental in this outreach to China in the 90s. US multinationals globalized the sourcing and production and embraced just-in-time manufacturing techniques to reduce costs. Global trade from, and these are three numbers that are very important, from 1990, global trade in 1990 was about 39% of global GDP. That percentage jumped to 61% in 2008. 2008 was a critical time. We had the financial crisis. After 2008, we have a reduction of this to 58%. This percentage is exactly before COVID hit, right? So we have what the economist calls slobalization, a lesser globalization moving with less high pace due to additional demands for regionalized supply chains that are closer to the points of consumption, and they can respond much faster to the demands of customers. If you allow me to say, it's the Amazon quote-unquote effect. COVID came and accelerated these trends, right? And revealed additional supply chain risks related not just to us as consumers have access to tons of goods that are coming from overseas and China, but also to US national security and competitiveness. So when President Biden issued 2 weeks ago the executive order asking for the critical assessment of 4 supply chains, right? Pharmaceuticals, large capacity batteries, semiconductor chips that I already spoke about, and rare earth minerals, the latter are critical for hypersonics, aviation. All 4 are critical for the well-being of the national security of the United States. Pharmaceutical-wise, I'm reminding the audience, and Scowcraft had a great event that I was honored to participate last October. RX90, a phenomenal book by Rosemary Gibson that participated in the event. 90% of the pharmaceutical ingredients that we use in the US are coming from China. Following the what happened, how am I doing with time, Raymond? I have 3 more minutes, 2 more minutes. So following COVID, we keep on hearing, and this is the last thing I want to talk about, and then hopefully I have the chance to add some additional Hubbell insights. Following COVID, everybody talks about resilience. So what is supply chain resilience? And dear Raymond, allow me to say here that this is not well understood. I had a discussion with a leader in DC, a very knowledgeable leader, that still doesn't understand this. Supply chain resilience is an established academic field and also a practice in Fortune 500s that has been developed during the last 25 years by merging 2 fields, supply chain management and risk management. So supply chain resilience refers to the ability of a given supply chain to prepare for and adapt to unexpected events. Events could be disruptions that we chronically see, Fukushima or Black Swan type events, Fukushima natural disaster in 2011, the plague that is hitting us now, or the ever-given blocking the Suez Canal. And it could be referring also to chronically experienced disruptions in transportation, in supply, in demand. During COVID, we had the disruptions also in demand, right? Demand spike for certain items, certain other items. For certain other items, it got really weakened, and we experienced supply chains not having the ability to shift from one production of one SKU to another, from commercial toilet paper to toilet paper that is used for households, along with panic buying, of course. So supply chain resilience refers to the ability of the supply chain to prepare and adapt to unexpected events, to quickly adjust to disruptive changes, and to continue functioning during disruption, further recovering as quickly as possible to its pre-disruption state, right? So we talk about this life cycle that we employ within resilience, namely prepare, plan, detect and respond, and recover as quickly as possible. Final thought, we need to stratify commercial supply chains from supply chains that are critical to the security and the well-being and the competitiveness of the United States, especially as it tries to raise up the role of liberal democracy as a prerequisite for economic growth against autocracies. In this new environment, we have new challenges ahead of us that we need to start thinking about. And I have tremendous respect for China, the Middle Kingdom, as they would like to say. I will beg during the discussion, Raymond, if you allow me, that we can potentially mirror some of their policies that they employed, shielding ourselves, shielding our supply chains, the critical supply chains to the nation, in order for US companies and the US manufacturing defense industrial base to be competitive against what? The state-owned enterprises, the SOEs that are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. I hope I didn't talk too much. And I hope
you certainly gave us a lot to think about. No. Your comments are always really insightful, and you gave us a lot to think about. And I'm really interested to see now Gary's comments, right? We're going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Raymond, for organizing this event, and to the Mosbacher Institute for beginning to frame these issues. And Lefteris, I think, has raised a number of the big themes we'll be talking about over the hour. Part of it is the fact that, especially with COVID-19, everybody's thinking global supply chains nowadays. The shortages of various products that we've seen, from medical supplies to food products to toilet paper, has everybody wondering what's going on with supply and demand with this major global disruption. And I want to focus later on some of the research on some of these questions. But I think it might be useful to take a step back at the beginning, because Lefteris talked about how supply chain management and risk management come together to help international business think about what global supply chains are involved in. I want to take a step back because I come from an area of social sciences. I'm trained as a sociologist. I've done lots of field work and work with many other social science colleagues. And we have been trying to link over a number of years global supply chains and development. And I think that connection started because many of us in our field research dealing with various countries, usually developing countries around the world, were initially looking very closely at the role of multinational corporations in a variety of global industries that affected how these countries might develop. And we began to realize that we were at a bit of an impasse because the people that were looking at multinational corporations and global industries had one perspective, but pretty much looking from the top down in terms of the global economy. There was another group of researchers very much embedded in different country experiences that were looking at particular industries or industrial districts and trying to figure out how countries were trying to become more competitive. And they were looking at these issues from the bottom up. And so in the early 2000s, the Rockefeller Foundation sponsored a group of scholars from both of these perspectives, the top down and the bottom up, from a lot of different disciplines: sociology, political science, political economy, economic geography, city and urban planning, etc., applied economics, and basically asked us to come together over 5 years. It was a great project to try to develop an integrated framework to link issues of multinational companies and supply chain management with what's going on in terms of development policies and experiences within developing countries, especially. And out of that project came something that was called the Global Value Chains Initiative. The term was coined in 2001, I guess, when we started that Global Value Chain Initiative. And I worked with colleagues like Tim Sturgeon at MIT and John Humphrey at IDS Sussex and Mike Morris and Rafi Kaplinski and many others in trying to piece together the framework. But at the end of that 5 years, Rockefeller Foundation said something quite important. It's great to create a network of scholars from all these different fields that are doing this kind of research, but how do you institutionalize it? How do you keep that network going? And at that stage, they asked if we could create a global value chain project or initiative in a university, and I offered to do it at Duke University, and that's what gave rise to the Global Value Chain Center. And I see that Raymond has really been pioneering, along with a set of colleagues at Texas A&M, this Mosbacher Institute. At the same time as Rockefeller had that global objective, the Sloan Foundation was also sponsoring a lot of research centers at American universities trying to look at US manufacturing and what's the future of manufacturing and the future of work. So all of these questions that we're trying to grapple with, I think, need a university context to help drive that work forward and to bring together the different knowledge communities. Because as we'll see when we talk about specific industries, it's not just trade, foreign direct investment, finance at the top level, but really detailed knowledge of technology developments and how international business thinks about supply chain dynamics. And so I've been involved now, especially since COVID broke out, as have many of my colleagues, on a lot of work dealing with the implications of COVID-19 on various global industries, as well as the US economy. And so it allows us to kind of pool the perspectives that we've been developing from the GVC framework and try to create some sort of research in which a deep knowledge of industries, both from global companies down to local firms in the different places where industries are embedded, is linked with policy questions that are coming out of every country. But Lefteris already mentioned the kinds of things that we've been seeing in the US context, beginning with the push in the Trump administration for Operation Warp Speed to all of the changes that the Biden administration wants to introduce. So I would just say that this kind of initiative and universities that are taking it up, like Texas A&M and Duke and others, I think are at a critical juncture to try to bring together the best people to try to frame the questions correctly and start to provide some good answers that could be relevant to both the business and policy communities, as well as providing better theories from the academic point of view.
Raymond, would you allow me to add on something on what Gary discussed?
Sure.
So outstanding positioning from Gary. Allow me to say that I feel the United States government, the interest of the United States government today, Gary, with the interests of a lot of the multinationals, are following divergent paths. So US multinationals have been financializing, if you allow me the expression, financialization, right? It's at the core of what raised populism across the United States. But they did that to the supply chains. Instead of re-engineering the supply chains, they've been focusing on what? Re-engineering the bottom line, right? So when they buy back stock to increase share price or pay dividends, to increase the bonuses, where at the same time the supply chains are brittle and they're really orchestrated, allow me the Greek word hubris, with hubris, pretending that we can treat them as deterministic networks. So multinationals work like that. And then there's another path that the government is looking for, which is resilience, diversification, right? Less tying with adversaries outside, so a new geopolitical environment. This issue is further exacerbated, Raymond, by the outsourcing that the federal government has experienced of its own capabilities during the 80s and the 90s. So the US government, I question Gary and Raymond, does he have the capability to redefine policy along with bringing all these stimuli from technocrats across the different disciplines to do that, to meet the new realities where in the new realities, the US government should become again a moonshot orchestrator, reinventing the Apollo type mentality, right? Calling to arms universities, the willing and able, of course, universities, Raymond, along with industries, to develop supply chains critical to the nation that are resilient at a cost-competitive environment. That's the next generation that I'm talking about. In my humble experience with companies, and Gary, feel free to pitch in here, whenever you try to talk to companies about the needs of the government, there's always fear. It's the black ops guys that are coming from DC. The other way around, the government doesn't necessarily understand. The government operates in different clock times. I'm using Charles Fine term from MIT. The government doesn't understand clock times of the private industry. So we need honest brokers, Raymond, to bring together the two entities and redraft policy critical for the national security competitiveness, and allow me to say the global leadership of the US. And as such, the GVC, along with other leading initiatives that we have at Texas A&M, I can talk about the Secure America Institute that we have within the Rallis campus, or the Energy Institute, where we focus on resilience for continuous supply chains for the energy sector, right? They can play a powerful role.
Yeah, so Gary, if you want to respond a little bit to that, just about how what role academia can play in bringing these people together, and how can we sort of extend that work that you began at Duke, right? What are the next steps that need to be taken?
So I think that the part of what Raymond is pointing to in these comments is when we start looking at what is the role of the US, and I think it's really involving us rethinking economic globalization writ large. I mean, he mentioned the term snowballization, which is what economists are starting to talk about. And this gets to the role of academia. I think one thing we do in academia is we have to provide some kind of historic perspective to the particular crisis that we're in. So in the last 4 or 5 years, we've been in the midst of a lot of changes that have people thinking that we are undoing a lot of the institutions of the post-World War II legacy. And we've got trade wars and we've got competition and conflicts looming, in particular, I think, trade disputes with not only China, but Mexico, Canada, and lots of other former allies. So the question is, how do we make sense of this? So one thing I think we have to do from an academic point of view is put this period in a bigger framework. When President Biden just introduced this big infrastructure package in his speech in Pittsburgh, he and others link that back to the biggest government investment in the US since the interstate highway program under Eisenhower and the space race with the Soviet Union. So one thing I think we need to do is understand that this kind of geopolitical competition that we're in right now, it's analogous, first of all, to our the conflicts with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the 50s and the 60s, when it wasn't just nuclear weapons that gave that such importance, but it was also with the space race, high tech. It was a race to the top. And we began to worry about not just Sputnik giving the Soviet Union a critical advantage, but where are we going to come up with the people, the astrophysicists and others that we would need to create the technologies so we can compete? Fast forward a little bit to the 1970s and 80s. Remember, Japan is number one was a big mantra in the 1980s, and it wasn't clear that the US economy was competing on a level playing field with Japan. And there was a lot of concern that Japan as an export economy was taking advantage of the US market. But it wasn't even just Japan. It was Germany, South Korea, Taiwan. All of those countries were exporting incredibly effectively to the US in the 70s and 80s. So what happened? We began to introduce protectionist measures like tariffs, voluntary export restraints in the automobile industry, orderly marketing agreements with things like televisions and other electronics. So the point was we had another era of trade wars, which in a sense was anytime we get asymmetries where some countries are exporting, are becoming the super exporters, the big importers, especially the most industrialized economies like the US, are going to react to try to protect their domestic industries. I think if we go present day now with China, it's in an era when we've been hearing a lot of talk about economic nationalism in various parts of the world. You know, Brexit really started that rethinking of how are the countries that had been the key architects of the Bretton Woods system, how are they viewing their position in the international order? And again, there's a lot of academic literature about this, but part of it is the rise of China that, as Lefteris mentioned, really accelerated after 2001. But another part is the rise of a much bigger set of emerging economies. Initially, they talked about BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but it's also Indonesia, South Korea, Mexico, et cetera. So I think what we have now is we have to think about what makes sense for the US in the context of this new era of international competition. And I think one big, in every era, the countries that we were competing with had critical assets or advantages. With the Soviet Union, it was clearly nuclear weapons, space race technology, et cetera. With Japan, Germany, and other super exporters of the 80s, it was a sense that they had an export model where they could produce at home, send abroad, and that was unfair. So part of what happened after we introduced a lot of these trade restrictions is Japan, Germany, and other countries began to try to jump over those barriers and invest inside the US. So if you look at the automobile industry today, half of production and more than half of employment is made up of foreign companies, and the other half US companies. So in some ways, protectionism has often hurt US competitiveness, not helped it, because as countries responded to it, it's actually made them tougher competitors. The final thing I'd say about China and US today is that I think a big change factor is we have also entered into a digital era, or some people talk about the fourth industrial revolution or industry 4.0. So now the competition, China and the US seem to be ahead of everybody else in terms of digital technologies, the big platform companies, e-commerce and the like. And so I think this is ushering in a different kind of strategic competition. Part of it's going to be around products like semiconductors, electric batteries, active ingredients in pharmaceuticals, the things that President Biden mentioned and Lefteris was alluding to. But another big threat is going to be cybersecurity. And cybersecurity involves China, it involves Russia, it could involve Iran, it involves the US. So I think what academia is helping us do as we look at it through a global value chain lens is to try to frame the nature of strategic competition so that we can focus on issue areas like cybersecurity or semiconductors or new industries and new technological developments connected to advanced manufacturing, which is where I think university centers like Texas A&M, MIT, Caltech, and others are critical. But then what does that mean for the rest of the countries in the world as well? What does COVID-19 vaccines mean for sub-Saharan Africa, mean for India? So I think the value chain framework, as I look at it and try to use it, really allows us to bring those questions together in a way that gives us a bigger international perspective. We can talk about US or North-North relations, but we can also talk about North-South and South-South. And I think when you link global value chains and development, we have a much bigger set of issues to unravel than just all the challenges of supply chain management, which is tough enough from an international business point of view.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I do want to just emphasize that this conversation is meant to bring in people from across the university. We got a great question from our friend Stratos, who we've worked with a little bit, and we appreciate you joining us. He wants to raise the issue of this interconnectivity of global supply chains and value chains, which introduces this interdependence. And so his question really is that when you talk about pharma, you talk about specific industries within manufacturing, and call those critical, right? Don't we have to look dynamically across these different industries to understand better and hedge against the interdependencies when we think about resilience? And the reason why I kind of pitched this is kind of, Gary, because I know that this is what your view has been about, right? The global value chains approach is different in that way. Would you like to just comment on that? And then Lefteris, we'll turn it to you.
Let me make two comments. One, the relationship between supply chains and value chains. Supply chains is that input-output structure, that foundation on which all kinds of international trade and investment gets built in any given industry or product area. Value chains or global value chains raises the question, who along that supply chain tends to have the most power to set the terms for the other firms? So a supply chain dynamic, but also very critically, who's creating and capturing the value across the chain? So the chain has organizational characteristics, different kinds of firms, but it also has geographic characteristics. And so that's one of the issues that's coming up in sort of US policy or China policy or European policy, when we're looking at things like Google or Facebook or anything else, are we capturing enough of the value? So to me, that's a critical relationship. The value chain adds this question of power and value to the supply chain base. But I think it is then really critical to look not only across industries, but even inside industries, because when you take a supply chain point of view, industry and product differences matter a lot. So let me just give a quick example in medical supplies, which I've been looking at quite a bit in terms of COVID-19. 4 products jump out with different kinds of supply chain dynamics. One is rubber gloves and hospital gowns that have been essential for hospital workers. The second is face masks. Third was ventilators. And the fourth is vaccines. All of these products have come up around issues of shortages. And what can the US or other countries do to manage these shortages? But what I think we see when we look at it from a value chain point of view is we reframe the discussion. A lot of the value supply chain discussion has been built around this question of rigidity or resilience. And we've already been talking, either the supply chains are opting for efficiency, but they've become too rigid, sole sourcing or only in acute, or they try to become more resilient, but then what is, resilience for whom? Does resilience just mean bringing everything back to the US or changing the structure? So what I find, like looking at these products, people I think have been very surprised in the 20s about the extent of US reliance on Asian sourcing. China is the big player, but it's not just China. The question is, why so much Asian sourcing? If we look at rubber gloves, for example, the key exporter for the world has been Malaysia. And number 2 has been Thailand. Why? Because they have natural rubber that is a critical input to rubber gloves, and they've been able to produce a very simple, relatively simple product in a cost-effective manner. If we go to face masks, it's quite different. We have the simpler surgical mask or the N95s, but both of them require a filter that uses a very specialized kind of non-woven polypropylene melt-blown fabric. So from a GBC point of view, when I'm looking at that industry, the shortage wasn't just making the face mask, it was providing that critical input. And when I interviewed companies like 3M or Honeywell, and you look at where that melt-blown fabric comes from, China actually has a critical ability, not just to make it, lots of companies make it, but to ramp up scale. And I think this is one of the critical issues we have to come back to when we look at China's role. China was able to increase its production of key materials like melt blown through both state-owned enterprises and multinationals 10, 15, 20 times in a couple months. And so I think that that's what's allowed China to become a player in these renewed exports. US is doing it, but on a short-term basis. If we look at ventilators, ventilators are much more complex products. Face masks have about 65 parts. Ventilators have 450 to 650 parts. What we've discovered in the US is we had to use the Defense Production Act because you needed companies that had sufficiently complex supply chains like automakers to partner in ventilator production with the medical device companies. And we could do it, but again, it was sort of a short-term solution. And vaccines, I think, is the most fascinating of all because it's clearly innovation-driven. You needed the big R&D companies to come in and do that. But even once vaccines have been out and approved, we still have to ask who in the world is going to make them at scale for the rest of the world. India becomes a key player, US. So I think there in vaccines, we have to look across the whole supply chain, not just the R&D part to create those vaccines, which was, I think, an unprecedented accomplishment. Obviously, we did in 1 year, it would have taken 10. But we have to look at also manufacturing and distribution. So when I even look inside medical supplies for COVID-19, I see really different issues in each of those products that would help us figure out what the US needs to do to be more competitive, but also what the supply chain issues are for other countries in the world.
So you raise a lot of issues that I know that Lefteris has brought up. Lefteris, would you like to go ahead and we could address the China?
Like I'm copying copious notes. I mean, it's so difficult to follow up with Gary. What's Stratos Pistikopoulos' question, Raymond?
He was talking about why should we focus on just a few industries as critical.
Dr. Pistikopoulos, right?
Much interconnectivity between them.
It was Dr. Pistikopoulos, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's the director of the Energy Institute, one of the leading energy institutes that we have in the United States. The thesis here, Raymond, for me is we have to stop treating supply chains as perfectible machines, deterministic supply chain networks, but now we got to treat them as complex, adaptive systems. And I think Stratos shares that view, where we need to balance cost efficiency with resilience. Resilience costs money. Resilience provides, we have to have diversified sourcing. General Motors today sources engines from Asia, but they still have figuratively 10% of local supply. In case there's a disruption from Asia, what does the local supplier do? It boosts production, right, to cover some of the losses of supply that we have from Asia. Diversification costs money. Diversification is going to be different per industry. Gary brought something huge. That Gary, allow me to share this with friends who attend. We cannot treat supply chains the same way. Supply chains are stratified, different risk vectors of COVID. For textiles that I know you, Gary and Raymond, have done leading work, different from semiconductor chips, right? Different for rare earth minerals. In semiconductor chips, for example, the US controls about 36% of the output, right? President wants to do more in the United States. The answer, Gary, to your point, fully agree with you. Restoring 100% is not the answer. So while you control 36%, we worry about China's ability, Gary, as you said, to scale up. They control now 6%. Let us remind ourselves that South Korea and Taiwan, last time we checked, they're still democracies and partners of the United States control another 56. So the vision is, and I think some people in the Washington DC share that, let's reconfigure these global supply chains for critical supply chains to the nation, Raymond, will willing enable trading partners to create a sophisticated portfolio that includes some reshore within the United States, some nearshore, Gary mentioned Mexico, Canada, and some offshore with allies, trading partners and allies, bypassing still, Gary, employing rule-based economies as opposed to others, bypassing failed institutions that we helped, and we had thousands of young Americans dying at the shores of Europe to establish this. Let's not forget that. So bypassing these failed institutions to create new supply chains that support democracy, well-being for citizens, along with security of the nation and resilience. These, Raymond, are totally new challenges. And allow me to say here, Gary, I mean, so many things that you're bringing up. Gary mentioned, what led us to the point that we're sitting right now? Short-term mentality versus long-term. There's some positive developments. In 2019, the Business Roundtable, encompassing the 180 largest US companies, right, got together and asked for a refocus, a shift from maximizing shareholder value to maximizing stakeholder value. This is July of 2019. This is pre-COVID. Allow me to say very humbly that my thesis, this is a monumental time where stakeholders now are not just the shareholders, but rather the workers, the environment that I know Raymond cares about passionately, society, and the nation that these multinationals exploit its infrastructure. So we have an opportunity to start employing that, to start thinking long-term, Raymond, instead of focusing on this short-term mentality. It is an opportunity. A great leader that I admire, a former president of Texas A&M, Robert Gates, former Secretary of Defense under 3 different US presidents and CIA director, talks about re-engaging the world, employing the soft powers of the United States. And this is an opportunity for us to do that. Final thought, Raymond, to your question, the previous question, what can a university do, an entity like GVC? I'm quoting a leader from DOD that she gave us some feedback on the Secure America Institute Winter Summit that we had last week. She said, help us depoliticize these issues. And I think that's critical. And once it comes with a well-being honest broker mentality, right, along with solid scientific interdisciplinary approaches, we can add value. We cannot think about manufacturing isolated, for example. Why does the President of the United States ask for reevaluation of supply chains and not just manufacturing? Because they understand that manufacturing has to be embedded properly within these supply chains. And guess what, Raymond? We don't have a magic button that we can push and reshore. We cannot produce SME, semiconductor equipment in the US, right? The choke point for reshoring semiconductor chips is lack of the ability to produce semiconductor equipment as opposed to South Korea and Taiwan. And allow me to say here that we got to start thinking about spillover effects that Gary spoke about, right? So the Apollo endeavor, that ambitious effort of the United States government that rallied the best, right, across different disciplines, industry, academia, did it employ a static cost-benefit analysis tool? If it would never have happened. Yet the spillover effects in innovation across a different area of not just advanced manufacturing, but organizational innovation that Gary spoke about were phenomenal and boosted the leadership of the US for decades to come. For example, the Texas A&M Gary system has a phenomenal boost development complex at Raleigh campus, right? A campus that is focusing on late technology readiness levels. That's an unbelievable investment of $500 million of TAMU system, of course, with the support of the state. What do I see there as a humble observer? And I'm not speaking for the Boost Development Complex there, even though the Secure America Institute for which I work is embedded there. Industrial commons, right? Manufacturing, co-location in manufacturing still matters. Raymond, it employs labor market pooling, right? Common infrastructures, the ability to collaborate physically and collocate, spillover effects. So these are the things that we have to think through if we want to re-engage society. To do a moonshot, I specifically humbly stipulate that we need 2 things: charismatic leadership and engagement of societal stakeholders, Raymond. And I think GVC could be critical, along with other great universities that Gary spoke about, in adding value there.
We have a lot of students here today, and some of them are sending in some questions. I want to make sure that they feel incorporated. So I want to make
Absolutely. I think the major stakeholders are the students.
Yeah, exactly. One of our stars, who's Olga Bedrug, who's here. She's asking about the future of supply chains in China, Taiwan, and the Philippines, in particular with the semiconductor industry. So if we do push for this reshoring, particularly of semiconductors, maybe from a development perspective or from a supply chain perspective, what would happen in particular these countries, would you say?
Gary, please.
Yeah, well, I think one of the issues on supply chains, I mean, China is very interested in semiconductors. Korea, Taiwan are very big semiconductor, Japan, et cetera. So every country's doing different things. For China and places like Indonesia in particular, I think actually critical technologies are around e-commerce. I mean, where China has made amazing advances and Indonesia is doing the same, is they're using the digital economy to connect suppliers and consumers in dramatically new ways, even much similar to what we've been doing in the US with Amazon and others. So to me, digital economy, as I mentioned earlier, is a bit of a technology game changer. And semiconductors is part of that because of 5G networks. But the critical thing is having fast broadband, which I think speaks to a much bigger definition of infrastructure for today. Infrastructure isn't just, as we heard from the Biden team and everything, it's not just the ports, roads, et cetera. That's important, but it is, rural 5G, and it's also human capital development. So to me, that's what I'm looking at in Asia, is how they're trying to push and use digital technologies and 5G infrastructure and Internet of Things, as well as artificial intelligence, to create these new technologies of the future, of which semiconductors is one.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Lefteris, did you have something to add to that?
Jennifer told me if I don't provide an answer, I will have to pay you back. And so I provide an answer.
Hardly.
No, that's a great question. Let me remind us, let us remind ourselves. I wrote down two numbers, two types. China has the J-20 aircraft, which is a complete copy of F-22. It has the J-31, which is the quick copycat of our F-35. And before that, in 2011, I believe, Israel sold plans to China of F-16s, and now they have the J-10s. That's how they started. So the game is very intense. If we think semiconductor chips is an area that China is investing, by the way, China does nothing in limbo. Even those who avoid Gary, allow me respectfully to say China envy, right? I do not know men and women trying to jeopardize their lives to enter Russia or China. So let's start from a position of strength, believing in what we bring as the United States. The supply chains, if we believe that they invest in artificial technology, if we believe they invest in, and we know they have the China 2025 policy, right? The same way that Germany has Industry 4.0. And we need a strategy like this, Raymond. I'm not going to call it industrial strategy, but we need a strategy. So if we know they're going to invest there, are we still going to be gullible and act with naivete in opening the doors to them? I humbly put on the table that we should have been doing this. We got to be mindful of what the issues are. And reshoring, as I said, I emphasize to the students, issue reshoring 100% is not the issue, right? The beef market has suffered in the US, 100% reshore due to COVID. Gary knows that better than that. Diversification, reshore, nearshore, and offshore with trading partners and allies is a key point. President Clinton in 2000, I wrote it down. I just want to share this with you. He said at the time, since Gary spoke about e-commerce, he said at the time, well, the internet will change everything in China, right? And I put down the quote. He said, good luck. Trying to control the internet is just like trying to nail gel on the wall. Guess what? They've done that. They've done that, right? So if I want to go and Google in China, July 1989, Tiananmen Square events, I cannot find anything. E-commerce sites, they excluded H&M overnight, right? I cannot even find Google Maps to how can I go to one of the 300 H&M stores. So this is a different environment. We got to be mindful. Look what happens with Ma and ants IPO being postponed because apparently he said some things that the Chinese government overregulates the financial market. So we got to become more savvy.
So are you suggesting, I mean, one of the questions is, are you suggesting that we need to be more proactive in terms of regulation? I mean, the Chinese are obviously very strict and extensive with their regulatory reach, right? Is that the same kind of emphasis you'd like to see in this country, or?
I'm saying, Raymond, the following, that when I look at this machine, right, the majority of the apps or the innovations here are coming from DARPA. I got my first vaccine of Moderna. Moderna was funded by DARPA, right? Intel got huge monies from the United States government in the beginning. Tesla, billions of dollars of low interest rates, right? What I'm suggesting is the United States government start acting like a VC, like a venture capitalist, to be less risk averse, embrace a portfolio of strategic initiatives. Raymond, some of them will fail, but some of them will be able to address these new realities with terrific spillover effects, engaging that stakeholder capitalism that I spoke about, namely multinationals, workers, society, and the US government together.
Mm-hmm. Gary, do you have a sense of how that might be affecting the power dynamics if the US government takes a more proactive role in supply chains?
Well, I think, yeah, just to reiterate, our role in terms of R&D and innovation, government has played a critical role in doing that. But I guess I would want to reiterate something that Lefteris was saying earlier. You know, to me, this is really a discussion more about reglobalization than deglobalization.
Yes, absolutely.
This whole idea, the point that for the U.S. to kind of reassert a much stronger position means we need to try to bring everything back home. Doesn't work. It doesn't because we've got so many of the top multinationals in the world headquartered here, who themselves have lots of advantages because of their links to other parts of the world. So I think on the one hand, we've got an orchestration issue that the US government is critical in. We have an opportunity to decide which things we want to bring back to the US economy. And I think there are clearly some strategic investments where we have to think, is it the end product or is it the active ingredient? Is it a process technology or is it a final? And I think we still are the innovative leader across so many fields, but picking and choosing which are the things we want to bring back to the US, I think requires a kind of public-private expert committee dialogue, which we really haven't had in the past. When we saw the scrambling that was going on about trying to find people that could make ventilators and face masks, that's partly because we didn't have a very good catalog of how current US industries are organized. So to me, that's step number one. We want to get better information inside the country between government and private sector of who's doing what. But I think as Lefteris was mentioning, this has to be a multi-stakeholder initiative because it's not just private firms and government. We've got labor organizations that are also interested in the future of work. And we've got many other NGOs that are interested in sustainable development, et cetera. So I think the thing that we are probably best suited to do because of the democratic setting we're in is this kind of orchestration of bringing together the key players to the table. And again, I think that's where universities are pretty critical because universities provide a meeting ground in many ways for all of these different stakeholders and an opportunity to discuss and come out with conclusions from those discussions. A lot of times when I've talked to multinationals, they know what each other's doing, but there's so much involved with the day-to-day, week-to-week competition issues, they don't have a chance to strategize longer term. Government strategizes, but they're often not in close contact with the change makers, which are the companies. So I think when we've been doing this kind of global value chain work, it really has had this multi-stakeholder approach, especially if we're going to be pushing sustainable development, because sustainability as well as inclusive development brings in other groups in society that often feel left out or marginalized. And so I think that's the role that it's not regulation per se, it's kind of orchestration, but with many strong assets, and you need government leadership for sure. And they have to be working together with leaders in the private sector. And because you're coordinating so many different industries, you also have the foundations and the other kinds of institutions we have in the US that have been think tanks for how to do this. But again, I would come back to universities have a unique position, I think, to bring these different groups together and try to articulate what some of those forward-looking plans might be.
Raymond, I couldn't agree more with Gary. I want to be clear to the students' questions because I'm here mainly for the students. I really value them, right? So I don't want the government to be involved on this. I don't want the government to be involved in the supply chain of hand sanitizers. So that's why I spoke specifically about stratification supply chains. However, I think the government has a critical role to play in semiconductor chips supply chains or supply chains for hypersonics. And going back to what Gary have said, Gary, I mean, it's been an honor communicating with you here. He mentioned the Russians, right? The Soviet Union. So maybe, Raymond, we need a George Kennan long telegram again. George Kennan in the 1946, right? So I'm a student of history. And my advice to students is read, please. Readers are leaders and leaders are readers, right? So George Kennan from Moscow sends a telegram, I think it's 8,000 letters telegram, saying what should be the policy of containing the very aggressive attitude of the Soviet Union at the time that was coming from its insecurity. We have similar adjustments that we need to make, Raymond, I think, towards the policy that we need to employ towards China. Going back to the federal government, allow me to wrap up with this. We have issues of compartmentalization of supply chain efforts across the federal government. I wrote a little piece on the Brookings text stream along with Chip White from Georgia Tech, where we specifically state there's the need for a one-stop shop for coordinating efforts of supply chains across different agencies that you know better than me, that they're not going to relinquish power, right? It's DOD, DOE, NIST, the National Defense Agency, the Strategic Stockpile System, the SNS, for which during COVID, there was no visibility whatsoever what was going on. So new ways of conducting business. And yes, as Gary said, universities are the advantage of the US. But allow me to say also here, universities are poised for major disruption. Gary, the majority of academic leaders have no clue what is coming up, right? So I admired the president of George Mason in DC, where he said to his faculty, get out of the public of Paris and move to the partner of Paris. And partnering could be NGOs, and these are my words, could be community stakeholders, local and federal government, could be multinationals. So in this new environment, I think it's universities like with the leadership of people like Raymond that are willing to break the silos and create new innovative teams to address these realities. They will enable universities that will be able to add value.
So that's wonderful. I know we're running up on the end of the time. I'd like to, since Lefteris, you started, we're going to let Gary end. And Gary, why don't you offer the last word? And
no, I would just sort of echo the setting again with how global value chains can be used, not as in the kind of the ivory tower academic sense of coming up with new ideas or pure theory. I think global value chain as a framework, because it's been so closely tied to international business and these other perspectives we've alluded to, really has a chance to shape the biggest policies we have coming up over the next 10 and 20 years in a very real way. And I think that's what I've always liked about it, is because the approach is dealing with specific industries and products like the semiconductors, electric batteries, et cetera. It's not talking overly general. In fact, it's this meso level, which I think links macro and micro, but because of its interdisciplinarity, you have to be part of a knowledge community. You know, in the US government, maybe defense and others, big departments, they have multiple disciplines also represented, their DOE, et cetera. But I think what we really need is forward-looking, grounded thinking that is comprehensive enough to capture the sweep of different global industries and the international relations challenges we've all been alluding to, but also specific enough to zero in on particular kinds of products and technologies and ask questions like, what's the future of work? How do we get the human capital we need, et cetera, which again is a unique role for universities, community colleges, and our education system more generally. So I think we have a role to play with that kind of a framework and bringing these pieces together. And again, hats off to the Mosbacher Institute for pushing this agenda at Texas A&M and linking it to other things that you're already doing at the university.
I can't even begin to tell you how much we value your support, Gary. You're such a superstar. Just having you here with us is such an honor. And Lefteris, your insights are always wonderful, and your energy and your leadership are incredibly valuable. So we thank all of you. We'd also invite you to the April 19th webinar we're having on global value chains, wages, and working conditions that we're partnering with the ILO. And we invite you all to that. In the meantime, thank you all very much, and we wish you the best of health. Thanks for joining us today.
I'm humbled for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.